Bullies target new black cooking lady, unaware her father is a Navy SEAL. Welcome to Dusk Tales. Let's uncover what really happened. The salt-scoured wind that swept through Port Blossom carried with it the ghosts of old sea shanties and the persistent scent of low tide. It was a town built on barnacles and bedrock, where family names were etched into the pier pilings like warnings, and newcomers were regarded with the same suspicion as a ship sailing under a strange flag. Alara James felt that suspicion in the air, a chill that had nothing to do with the coastal fog. She had come here to disappear, to let the ocean's rhythm wash away the sharp, metallic taste of failure. Her restaurant in the city, a place of gleaming copper pots and starlit reviews, had closed its doors 6 months prior, the victim of a partner's betrayal and a dream that had grown too heavy to carry alone. Now, she had only a small, sea-battered shack on the edge of the wharf, its windows clouded with salt spray, and a single cast-iron pot big enough to hold all her remaining hope. She called it the Broth, a name as simple and honest as the food she intended to serve. Soups, stews, chowders. Food that warmed from the inside out, food that didn't demand attention but offered comfort. It was a penance of sorts, a return to the fundamentals, a way to cook without the crushing weight of expectation. The town watcher set up. They saw the quiet black woman with hands that moved with practiced grace, her hair tied back in a simple knot, her eyes often fixed on the gray horizon as if searching for a fleet that would never return. They saw her scrubbing the old floorboards, painting a small, unassuming sign, and carrying sacks of potatoes and onions from the market with a strength that seemed at odds with her slender frame. They whispered, not with malice at first, but with the ingrained curiosity of a closed community. Who was she? Where did she come from? Why here? The whispers curdled when Preston Thorne took notice. Thorne owned the Gilded Lobster, the only real restaurant in town, a place of starched white tablecloths and overpriced, underwhelming fare. He was a man whose family had founded Port Blossom, and he saw the town not as a home, but as a birthright. He saw Alara's little shack, with its fragrant steam curling from the chimney, not as a humble enterprise, but as an intrusion, a weed in his perfectly manicured garden. He began his campaign subtly, with a word dropped to the fishmonger about the risk of selling to an outsider, a hint to the health inspector about unconventional kitchen practices. The town, loyal to its own, listened. The baker who had once offered a friendly nod now looked away. The market vendor suddenly had no more onions to spare. Alara felt the shift like a change in barometric pressure, the air growing thick and heavy, pressing in on her small sanctuary. Her customers, few as they were, dwindled to none. Days passed where the only person she served was herself, ladling a solitary bowl of leek and potato soup while staring out at the unforgiving sea. The grief she had run from had found her here, not as a sharp, sudden pain, but as a slow, creeping tide of isolation. She was at her lowest point, adrift in a harbor that refused to grant her shelter, the silence of her empty shop a roar in her ears. She thought of her father, a man who understood silence better than anyone. He was a creature of deep waters and quiet strength, a man who had taught her that resilience was not about the absence of wounds, but about the refusal to let them sink you. He was far away, on a different kind of sea, and she had promised herself she would not call him, would not burden him with her foundering ship. This was her storm to weather. But as the fog rolled in, thick and suffocating, and the last of her firewood dwindled, she wondered if some storms were simply too strong to face alone. The first time he came, the bell above her door chimed so softly she thought it was the wind. He stood there, framed by the gray light, a tall figure who seemed to bring the scent of the ocean and the forest with him. His face was weathered, carved by sun and sea, with eyes the color of a stormy sky. He wore a thick, hand-knit sweater and boots caked in mud and pine needles. He didn't speak, just looked at the small chalkboard menu, his expression unreadable. Alara's heart gave a nervous flutter. She hadn't had a customer in 3 days. "Just the chowder today," she said, her voice a little rough from disuse. He nodded, took a seat at the one small table, and waited. His silence was different from the town's. It wasn't a wall. it was a space. She ladled the chowder into a bowl, her hands steady despite the tremor in her soul. It was a simple New England style, thick with clams and potatoes, fragrant with thyme. She placed it before him with a slice of the sourdough she had baked that morning. He ate slowly, deliberately, his gaze fixed on the contents of the bowl. When he was finished, he pushed the bowl away, left 3 silver coins on the table, more than enough, and stood. He paused at the door, turned, and gave a single, slow nod. Then he was gone, swallowed by the fog. His name, she would learn later, was Finn. He was a fisherman, a woodsman, a man who lived in a small cabin up the coast, on the edge of the sprawling Thorne estate, but a world away from its influence. He was a widower, haunted by a tragedy the town had long since buried under whispers and time. He, too, was an island. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He never said more than a few words, but his presence was a quiet defiance of the town's unspoken embargo. He would sit at the same table, eat whatever she had made, and leave a few coins. His visits became the rhythm of her week, a single, steady beat in the overwhelming silence. One morning, she found a wicker basket on her doorstep. Inside, nestled in a bed of wet seaweed, were a dozen fresh mussels, their shells black and gleaming. There was no note. She knew who they were from. That day, she made a chupino, a rich, tomato-based stew simmering with the flavor of the sea. When Finn came, she served it to him. He looked at the bowl, then up at her, and for the first time, a faint smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a language they were building, one of gestures and offerings, of shared food and shared solitude. He began leaving things for her regularly. A bundle of firewood stacked neatly by her door, a string of freshly caught mackerel, a jar of wild berry jam made by his daughter, a shy, quiet girl named Maya who sometimes watched Alara from a distance with her father's stormy eyes. Alara, in turn, would save him the best portion of her soup, bake an extra loaf of bread for him to take home, or leave a warm apple turnover on the railing of his fishing boat before dawn. They were 2 solitary lighthouses, signaling to each other across a hostile sea. Their bond was forged not in conversation, but in the quiet ritual of care. He saw her not as the failed city chef or the unwelcome outsider, but as an artist whose medium was broth and herbs. She saw him not as the town recluse, but as a man whose quiet strength was a sanctuary. The town, however, saw their connection and its judgment hardened. Preston Thorne, in particular, viewed their silent alliance as a personal affront. A quiet bond was forming between them, a fragile plant taking root in the cracks of their shared loneliness. The more time Finn spent at the broth, the more Alara felt the ice around her own heart begin to thaw. It was in the small, unspoken moments that their connection deepened. She learned to read the lines around his eyes, to know when the sea had been rough or the forest had been generous. He learned the cadence of her work, the quiet hum that escaped her lips when she was stirring a pot, a sound of pure, unadorned contentment. His daughter, Maya, became a tentative bridge between them. The 10-year-old was as quiet as her father, with a wild, watchful quality, like a deer at the edge of a clearing. One afternoon, Finn brought her into the shop. Maya clutched her father's hand, her wide eyes taking in every detail of Alara's small kitchen. Alara didn't press, didn't try to force a conversation. Instead, she poured a small cup of her tomato bisque, creamy and sweet, and set it on the counter with a piece of grilled cheese cut into triangles. Maya looked at her father, who gave a slight nod. Hesitantly, the girl took a sip. A slow smile spread across her face, bright and genuine. After that, Maya started coming on her own, sitting quietly in the corner and drawing in a sketchbook while Alara cooked. She drew pictures of the sea, of her father's boat, and, eventually, of Alara herself, a tall, graceful figure surrounded by swirling lines of steam. The little shop, once a bastion of loneliness, now held the soft scratch of a pencil on paper and the gentle bubbling of soup on the stove. This quiet harmony did not go unnoticed. Preston Thorne's animosity grew with every passing day. He saw Finn's battered pickup truck parked outside the shack and felt a territorial rage. He saw the light in Alara's window burning late into the night and interpreted it as defiance. He couldn't comprehend a world where value wasn't measured in profit margins and social standing. The success of the broth, however small, was an insult to his own gilded mediocrity. He escalated his campaign. A complaint was filed with the town council about the smoke from her chimney. The health inspector, a cousin of Thorne's, paid a visit, armed with a clipboard and a sneer, scrutinizing every corner of her immaculate kitchen for violations that didn't exist. He left with a stern warning about potential infractions. Alara's suppliers, already hesitant, now refused her outright. The fishmonger suddenly had no more cod. The farmer's market was perpetually sold out of carrots by the time she arrived. It was a slow, deliberate strangulation designed to starve her out. Finn fought back in his own silent way. He brought her more fish than she could ever use. He bartered with fishermen in the next town over, trading his catch for vegetables and flour, which he would leave on her doorstep before sunrise. He repaired the loose shutter on her window and replaced the rotting step at her entrance. Each action was a nail hammered into Thorne's coffin of a plan, an act of loyalty that echoed louder than any threat. The tension in Port Blossom thickened, becoming a palpable thing, a fog that clung to the damp air. The town was divided. Some, the ones who worked the docks and knew the sting of hardship, watched with a quiet, grudging respect for the woman who refused to break. But most sided with Thorne, with the comfort of the familiar, with the fear of the other. The conflict came to a head on a windswept Tuesday. Alara arrived at her shop to find a front window shattered, jagged shards of glass littering the floor like frozen tears. In the center of the room, splashed across her clean, white wall, were the words "Go home" painted in slick, black tar. The smell was suffocating, a violation that went deeper than the broken glass. She stood there, frozen, the morning's loaf of bread still warm in her hands. The message was clear. This was no longer about business. This was about belonging, and she had been judged unworthy. She sank to her knees, the fight finally draining out of her. The pot on the stove was cold. The fire was out. The little shop felt like a tomb. She thought of packing her bags, of leaving this place and its suffocating prejudice behind. She could disappear again, find another town, another shore. But then she thought of Finn's quiet strength, of Maya's trusting smile. She thought of the warmth of the fire on a cold night, the taste of her own soup, a taste of home she had created from nothing. She thought of her father, of the unwavering discipline he had instilled in her. Control the chaos, he would say. Don't let the storm steer you. You're the captain. She stood up, her jaw set. She would not be sunk. Not here. Not now. She swept up the glass, her movements precise and angry. She scrubbed at the tar, the acrid smell stinging her eyes, but she refused to weep. That evening, when Finn arrived, he found her not defeated, but defiant. She had boarded up the window with a piece of driftwood, and on it, she had painted a new sign in bright, clear letters, "Home." He stood in the doorway, taking in the scene, the boarded window, the faint smell of tar, the fierce, unbroken light in her eyes. He walked over to the wall where the hateful words had been and ran his hand over the spot she had scrubbed clean. He looked at her, his stormy eyes holding a world of unspoken understanding. He didn't offer condolences or outrage. He simply picked up a hammer and a box of nails he had brought and began to properly fix her window frame. They worked together in silence as the sun went down, the rhythmic tap of the hammer a declaration of war against the encroaching darkness. They were no longer two islands. They were a peninsula connected and fortified, ready for the tide to turn. The act of vandalism was a turning point. It had been meant to drive Alara out, but instead, it solidified her resolve. The crude sign Finn had replaced with a sturdy new window pane, its glass clear and unflinching. Alara's home sign, painted on driftwood, remained propped in the corner, a testament to her defiance. But the attack had also galvanized Preston Thorne. Her refusal to be intimidated was a direct challenge to his authority, and he was not a man who tolerated challenges. He began to operate more openly, his whispers turning into public denunciations. At the town council meeting, He spoke of transient elements disrupting the community's character, of the need to preserve Port Blossom's heritage. Everyone knew who he was talking about. He leveraged his family's long-standing influence, calling in favors, reminding people of old debts. The pressure on Alara intensified. Her lease on the small shack, which was owned by a holding company with ties to the Thorne family, was suddenly under review for zoning irregularities. A petition circulated, citing vague concerns about commercial hygiene and public nuisance. It was a death by 1,000 paper cuts, and Alara felt each one. Finn stood with her, a silent bulwark against the tide. He spoke to the other fishermen at the docks, men who respected his skill and his quiet integrity. He reminded them of times when they too had been outsiders, of the harshness of the sea that made all men equal. A few listened. A small but loyal contingent of dock workers and their families started frequenting the broth, their presence a quiet protest. They would enter, nod to Alara, and order a bowl of soup, their calloused hands wrapped around the warm ceramic, a small act of solidarity in a town rife with division. It wasn't enough to save her business, but it was enough to save her spirit. The nights grew colder. The coastal winds howled around the little shack, rattling the new window pane. Alara and Finn would often sit together after she closed, the only light coming from the low-burning embers in her wood stove. In these quiet hours, the walls between them crumbled completely. He told her about his wife, how she had been lost to a sudden, violent squall at sea, a tragedy that had hollowed him out and turned him inward. He spoke of his fear for Maya, of wanting to protect her from a world that could be so cruel. Alara, in turn, told him about the city, about the exhilarating highs and crushing lows of the culinary world. She spoke of her father, not as the formidable figure he was, but as a man who taught her the importance of a well-sharpened knife and an unwavering moral compass. He always said the first principle of any operation is to know your terrain, she murmured one night, staring into the fire. I thought he meant the kitchen. I'm starting to think he meant places like this. The final blow came in the form of an eviction notice, tacked to her door on a gray, drizzly morning. It cited a litany of fabricated violations and gave her 30 days to vacate. The language was cold, legal, and absolute. Preston Thorne had one. That evening, Alara was a ghost of herself. She moved through the motions of making a final pot of soup, her hands listless, her eyes empty. When Finn arrived, he found her sitting at the table, the eviction notice lying beside a single, untouched bowl. He read the notice, his jaw tightening until a muscle pulsed. He sat down opposite her, saying nothing. The silence in the room was heavier than it had ever been, filled with the weight of defeat. I'm sorry, Finn, she whispered, her voice breaking. I tried. This isn't on you, Alara, he said, his voice a low rumble. This is on them. On this town. I have to leave. There's nothing left. There's us, he said quietly, reaching across the table and covering her hand with his. His touch was warm, solid, an anchor in the storm. She looked up, tears finally spilling from her eyes. It's not enough. We can't fight him. For a long moment, she let herself believe him. She let the warmth of his hand seep into her, a fragile hope. But the reality of her situation was a cold, hard stone in her gut. She had no money, no allies with power, no legal recourse. Thorne owned the town, from the council to the constabulary. She withdrew her hand slowly. Thank you, Finn, for everything. But I can't let you and Maya get pulled down with me. He looked as if he wanted to argue, but he saw the finality in her eyes. He stood, his heart heavy, and left her to her grief. That night, alone in the dark, with the wind crying at her window and the eviction notice a pale ghost on her table, Alara James finally did what she had promised herself she wouldn't. She picked up her old satellite phone, the one her father insisted she keep for emergencies, and punched in a number that was committed to memory. The call connected after a single, silent ring. A calm, steady voice answered. Talk to me, Dad, she said, her voice choked with a sob she could no longer contain. I think I need you to come home. There was a pause on the other end, not of hesitation, but of assessment. What's the terrain? He asked. She closed her eyes, picturing the hostile town, the cold sea, the one man who had stood by her. Hostile, she whispered, but not entirely without allies. Understood, he replied. I'm on my way. When she hung up, the storm outside still raged, but the one inside her had finally broken. The captain was coming, and he knew how to navigate in the dark. His arrival was as quiet as the morning mist. A black, unmarked truck rolled into Port Blossom just after dawn, its tires making no sound on the wet asphalt. It parked not at the wharf, but on a side street with a clear view of the town square. A man stepped out. He was not large or imposing in the way of a brawler. His power was in his stillness. He was of average height, lean, with a face that was a mask of calm control. His hair was cut short, flecked with gray at the temples. He wore simple, practical clothing, dark jeans, a gray Henley, and a worn canvas jacket. Nothing about him screamed danger, yet it was there, coiled beneath the surface like a current in deep water. This was Marcus James, retired Navy SEAL, a man who had spent 30 years operating in the world's most dangerous shadows. He did not go to Alara's shop. His first principle was to observe, to understand the battlefield before making a move. For 2 days, he was a ghost in the town. He sat in the corner of the local diner, nursing a single cup of black coffee, for hours, listening. He walked the docks, his gaze taking in the power dynamics between the fishermen, the deference shown to Thorne's men. He watched Preston Thorne himself, noting his arrogance, his casual cruelty to his staff, the way he moved as if the world was his personal property. He saw Finn, too, and recognized a kindred spirit in the man's quiet solitude and the protective way his eyes would drift towards Alara's shack. He saw the way the townspeople avoided his daughter's gaze, the way they closed ranks against her. He gathered information not with questions, but with observation, piecing together the story from whispers, glances, and the palpable tension in the air. On the third day, he finally went to the broth. Alara was packing, placing her few cherished cookbooks into a cardboard box. When Marcus entered, she looked up, and for the first time in weeks, a genuine, relieved smile touched her lips. She ran to him, and he held her, his embrace firm and steady. He didn't offer platitudes or promises. He just held her until her shoulders stopped shaking. "Tell me everything," he said. And she did. She told him about Thorne, the sabotage, the eviction, about Finn and Maya, about the quiet war that had been waged against her. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression unchanging. When she was finished, he nodded slowly. "All right," he said. Time had changed the weather. His approach was not one of brute force. It was one of surgical precision. He started with the health inspector. Marcus found him at a bar in the next town over, a place where he thought he was anonymous. Marcus sat beside him, ordered a water, and began to talk. He didn't threaten. He simply laid out facts. He mentioned the inspector's gambling debts, the specific dates and amounts. He mentioned the unregistered boat he used for his less-than-legal fishing trips. He spoke quietly, his voice never rising, but every word was a perfectly placed blow. By the end of the conversation, the inspector was pale and sweating. The next morning, a revised health report was filed with the state, not the town council, citing Alara's kitchen as exemplary and noting evidence of malicious tampering in the initial inspection. Next, Marcus visited the head of the company that held Alara's lease. The man was a silent partner in several of Thorne's ventures. Marcus didn't talk about leases. He talked about offshore accounts, about tax discrepancies, about a certain shipment that had gone missing from the docks 2 years prior. He left a single, encrypted flash drive on the man's desk. 2 hours later, a courier delivered a new lease to Alara, valid for 10 years, at a rate that was a third of what she had been paying. Thorne was furious. He knew someone was pulling strings, but he couldn't see the puppeteer. He stormed down to the wharf, intending to confront Alara directly, to intimidate her into leaving regardless of any new lease. He found her not packing, but cooking, a large pot of bouillabaisse simmering on the stove, its rich aroma filling the air. Standing quietly by the counter, wiping a glass with a clean cloth, was Marcus. Thorne barged in. "What is this? Who do you think you are?" Marcus looked up, his eyes calm and cold. "I'm her father," he said. The simple statement hung in the air, charged with unspoken meaning. Thorne, for the first time, felt a prickle of genuine fear. This was not a man he could bully or buy. "This is my town," Thorne blustered, his voice a little too loud. "Is it?" Marcus replied, setting the glass down with a soft click. "Towns belong to the people who build them, not the ones who just inherit them. My daughter builds. She creates. What do you do, Mr. Thorne? Besides try to tear things down?" He took a step forward, and Thorne instinctively took a step back. "Let me be clear," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You will leave her alone. You will leave her business alone. You will not speak her name. If a single window is broken, if a single supplier refuses her, if she so much as gets a harsh look from one of your employees, I will not come here to have a conversation. I will simply dismantle your entire life, piece by piece. I will find every secret you have, and I will bring it into the light. Do you understand me?" Thorne stared, his face ashen. He saw no anger in Marcus's eyes, no emotion at all. He saw only a promise, delivered with the chilling certainty of a man who had made and kept far more dangerous promises before. He turned, without another word, and fled. The war was over. The news traveled through Port Blossom on the wind. Preston Thorne was a changed man, subdued, withdrawn. The townspeople, their pillar of influence now crumbling, shifted their allegiance. Suddenly, Alara was no longer the outsider. She was the woman who had stood up to Thorne and won. She was the daughter of the quiet, formidable man who had brought the town's bully to his knees without raising his voice. That evening, Finn came to the shop. He saw Marcus standing on the small porch, looking out at the sea. The two men regarded each other for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Two quiet men who knew how to protect what they loved. Finn looked past him to Alara, who was ladling soup into a bowl, a genuine smile on her face. The light was back in her eyes. The shop was no longer just a place of survival. It was a home. Marcus clapped a hand on Finn's shoulder. "She's a good cook," he said. "She's more than that," Finn replied. Marcus nodded. "I know." He stayed for another week, long enough to ensure the peace would hold, long enough to see the first new customers trickle in, drawn by curiosity and a newfound respect. He spent an afternoon with Maya, teaching her how to tie knots she'd never seen before. He shared a silent, satisfying meal with Finn and Alara, the three of them sitting around the small table like a family that had always been. When it was time for him to leave, he hugged Alara tightly. "Know you're to reign," he said. "I do now," she whispered back. As his truck disappeared down the coastal highway, Alara stood on her porch, the sea breeze on her face. Finn came and stood beside her. The broth was thriving. The town had, in its own grudging way, accepted her. She had found a home, not in a place, but in the strength she had discovered within herself, and in the quiet, steadfast love of the man beside her. The fog was lifting, and for the first time, the horizon looked not like an ending, but a beginning.